It is now my pleasure to call on Isabel Wilkerson, who will deliver the commencement address.
How beautiful it was to walk into the sound, the beautiful sound of the bagpipes, and to look out into the sea of expectant faces on the cusp of all that is possible. Those bagpipes really get to me every time I hear them. They are in some ways an emblem of the very thing that I have devoted so much of my adult life to. They are an emblem of the transfer of culture from across the ocean here to this continent, surviving and reminding us of where we all come from ultimately, wherever that may be. Thank you to Father Levesque, to the dedicated trustees, faculty, and staff of Niagara University. Good afternoon, overjoyed and relieved parents and family, and congratulations to the class of 2011. Believe it or not, I feel a deep connection to you, the class of 2011, because whether you couldn't have possibly been aware of this, but I actually have been on a parallel journey with you, plotting the course of your lives as I have been on this parallel journey that I began when you began your education. And when I say education, I don't mean Niagara University. I actually mean grade school. It was when you were learning multiplication tables that I began this huge thing called a book. I didn't know what I was getting into. I had never written a book before. I'd done all kinds of other things. I'd written for the New York Times. I'd won a Pulitzer. I'd been Chicago bureau chief, all wonderful and amazing things that I'm so proud of. And yet I had this other mountain that I needed to climb, and I set out to try to climb it. I didn't know where it would lead or how long it would take. It's a good thing I didn't know it would take as long as it did, because I don't think I would have tried it. This is the book, by the way. It's very well worn, and it took me 15 years to write this book. If it were a human being, it would be in high school and dating right now. This was going to be nonfiction, and that meant that I was going to need real people. I didn't know where I would find the protagonists for this book that I would need, if the people would be willing to talk with me, and if I could actually pull it off. I was jumping off a cliff into the unknown and risking what it seemed to be pretty much everything. No guarantees of success. But something in me said I just had to tell this story. I had to write this book. And what was this story that I felt I just had to tell? It was the greatest underreported story of the 20th century, in my view. It was about people jumping off a cliff, just as I was, and just as you are about to do. Only they were about to do this, or they were doing this, under circumstances that are almost unimaginable to those of us today. And this was not that long ago. These were people who were stuck in a caste system in the American South, an artificial and violent hierarchy that actually, believe it or not, made it illegal for a black person and a white person to merely play checkers together in Birmingham. It was illegal. This was a world in which, in courtrooms throughout the South, there was actually a black Bible and a white Bible to swear to tell the truth on. The sacred scriptures could not be touched by blacks and whites. The same book could not be touched by the different races. This was a world in which it was illegal, believe it or not, for a black motorist to pass a white motorist on the road, no matter how slowly they were going. Now, for those of you who drive, and I'm sure most of you in the class of 2011 drive very well, but for those of you who have ever been behind someone who is going 5 miles an hour and then stopping, and then continuing at 5 miles an hour, not knowing where they're going. You can see why I would say that maybe that rule alone could account for about a couple million people wanting to leave. And they did. In this great migration, it began in World War I and didn't end until the 1970s, and so it took up most of the 20th century. These people ended up having to leave the only place that they had ever known for a place that they had never seen in hopes that life might be better. Some actually had to flee for their lives. There were 6 million of them who did this, and they left the South for the North and the West during that time period I've described, during essentially most of the 20th century, and it was the largest internal migration that's ever occurred within the borders of our own country. These were people who had to leave parts of their own homeland to find another place in their own country in order to live out their lives as the citizens to which they had been born. It was the only time that American citizens have had to defect from one part of the country in order to be recognized as what they were. They were in some ways seeking political asylum within the borders of their own country, and this is universal and classic. They were doing essentially what the forebears of most everyone in this room had to have done just for us to be here. They're proxies for anyone who has ever crossed the Atlantic in steerage, the Rio Grande, or the Pacific Ocean to find freedom. Someone in all of our backgrounds had to do what these people did just for us to be here today. How many of us know or are descended from someone who was, say, we have a great-grandmother from Ireland who crossed the ocean to this continent and met a great-grandfather from Italy, or from Germany, or from France, or from Poland, or Russia, Scandinavia, Latvia, Lithuania, and started whole new lineages. Many of us would not even exist if you think about it. Think about your own lineages. Many of us would not even exist had someone not done what the people in this book did. And that means, again, someone jumping off a cliff into the unknown. I was so determined to tell this story that I actually recreated the journey of one of the 3 people that I found in order to write it. I interviewed over 1,200 people, narrowed it down to 3, and the 3 represent the 6 million, and ultimately all of the people who ever crossed the Atlantic or the Rio Grande or any place else in the world to get to what they perceive as freedom. So I tried to recreate the journey of one of these people. This man happened to have been a surgeon. He had been a captain in the Army during the Korean conflict, but he was not allowed to perform surgery in his own hometown of Monroe, Louisiana, when he got out of the war. And so what he decided to do was what immigrants all over the world have decided to do. He decided to leave. And he was setting out on a course for California, which is far, far from where he was from. It was going to require that he would have to drive across the desert, drive across the mountains in order to get to what he perceived as freedom. Freedom to him had a name, and it was California, and that's what he set out to get to. But he had a hard time making the crossing, much harder than he anticipated, because it turned out that in that year, 1953, and really continuing up into the 1970s, not that long ago, it turned out that people like him, African Americans, could not be assured of a room for the night, even when they were outside of the South, and he ran into that. He had to drive for 3 states without being able to get a room to rest for the night. And so I tried to recreate this, and I had my parents with me. I myself am a product of this migration. My mother migrated from Rome, Georgia. I often say she's from Rome, and people say, wow, she's from Rome? And then I say, Georgia, and they say, oh. They're thinking Rome, Italy. Not Rome, New York, I don't think, but could be. And my father migrated from Southern Virginia to Washington, D.C., where they met, married, and had me. And so I wanted them on this journey with me as I was recreating this man's experience of migrating. I rented a Buick as he had. He said if you'd seen his Buick, you would have wanted it too. And so that's what I did. We made the drive, and we came to the part of the journey where the road gets mean and, in fact, vicious. The states of the West are countries unto themselves, and so we were driving through very large states, through the desert, at night, through the mountains. We encountered hairpin curves, and I was sleepy because I wanted to experience what was it like to have to drive through all of that without being able to stop, as so many millions of African Americans had had to do during this great span of time during the 20th century. What was it like? What did it feel like? I wanted to know what it felt like to be able to have to grip the wheels for so long that your fingers begin almost to lock in place. I wanted to know what it was like to have your eyes grow so weary from sleep that they begin to ache. And still, there's more road. There are no cars on the street, the road that you're on. The road begins to curve. You're going north and south as much as you are west, and you're so tired you don't think you can go another mile, and yet you must. And so there we were. And I was beginning to veer off the road because I was falling asleep at the wheel. And my parents noticed this. They knew that the rule was that I had to do all the driving because that's what this person had to do. And they said at a certain point, you must stop the car. You must stop the car. And if you won't stop the car, let us out. And so we came to a place called Yuma, Arizona. And because it was no longer 1953 and we have come such a long way as a country, we were able to find any number of places that we could stop for the night. And I actually felt even more empathy for this person that I was writing about because he had not had that option at the time that he was making that drive. What are we to learn from all of this, from all that has gone before us? To me, it means that just as most Americans are descended from people who crossed the oceans to get here, most African Americans, believe it or not, that you meet in the North and the West are descended from people who took this great migration. And these people, by what they did, by making this great leap of faith, the power of the individual decision multiplied by millions can change a country. And that is what this ultimately did. It was a precursor to the civil rights movement, precursor to other movements that would ultimately take flower, take root. After many decades and generations of working to make change, finally change came in the 1960s. And it was the loss of all of these people from the South, the pressure that the loss of these workers from the South put on the South and on the North that forced the South to change, forced the North to pay attention, and ultimately the world changed for the better. When people migrate, when people immigrate, they don't do it for themselves, though. They are often doing it for the children and the unseen grandchildren and great-grandchildren who they hope will benefit from the sacrifice that they're making. And the result of any migration is often in the children. And the result of this particular migration, just to give you an example, is people such as Toni Morrison, who would simply not have been able to become the novelist and Nobel laureate that she did had her parents not left Alabama for Ohio, where she had the opportunity, which she wouldn't have had in Alabama, which was simply to go into a library and take out a library book. She couldn't have done that. And if you're going to become a Nobel laureate in literature, you kind of need to be able to get a book now and then. Other people who might not have even existed or whose names we would not even know are people like August Wilson, the playwright. Many musicians that we take for granted, Prince, Michael Jackson, Jay-Z, P. Diddy for the generation I'm speaking to here, Michelle Obama. There are so many aspects of culture that we take for granted that simply would not have existed. Jazz would not have existed. Motown would not have existed. Miles Davis, we would not even know his name. His parents migrated from Arkansas to Illinois, where he had the luxury of being able to learn his music and to perfect his craft, which he never would have been able to do in the cotton country of Arkansas. And the same goes for Thelonious Monk, whose parents migrated from North Carolina to New York when he was 5. And John Coltrane, who, believe it or not, got his first alto sax when he left North Carolina and arrived in Philadelphia. These are people who are known in the United States but are gifts to the world because they are just as popular here, in fact, perhaps maybe more so, popular here as well as in Japan, in Europe, and Asia, all parts of Asia, all parts of the world. These people are in fact gifts to the world, not just to the United States, and these are gifts of the Great Migration. The individual decision of an individual person can make and it can change the world in ways that we can't even imagine. That's the power of the individual human heart and the power of the immigrant spirit that propelled all of us to where we are. By their actions, whether they left Italy or China or Tennessee, they have left us a code of survival. They've left all of us, their heirs, the answers to many of life's questions as to what direction we should take, how we should live our lives. There are stories of great heroism and courage in all of our families. It is encoded into our very DNA, one might say, as to how to survive and how to succeed, whatever we are facing. I started this talk by talking about the experience of jumping off a cliff myself in order to write this book. So what was the end result of the 15 years that I spent working on this book? Well, first of all, I've been all over the country talking about it, and I can't stop talking about it because I feel so passionate about all of this. But the book has done all kinds of things. It's taken on a life of its own. It's won awards, and it's made the bestseller list. It's done all kinds of wonderful things. But the moment that I knew I had achieved my goal for this book was when I made an appearance at a library, a public library on Long Island. It was a cold, rainy, miserable November evening. It was packed in that library that night. It was standing room only, and there was a standing ovation, which was all wonderful and encouraging for me as the writer. But the moment when I knew I had achieved my goal was when the book signing line began to take shape. And it began to snake all around the perimeter of the room. And at the front of it was a grandmotherly woman. She was cradling 3 copies of the book in her arms. She had tears in her eyes. And she said to me, "I can't even talk about this book. I can't talk about this book because if I begin to talk about it, I will cry for sure. I can't talk about this book because it's my story. You see, I'm an immigrant from Greece, and this is my story." And at that moment, I realized that I had crossed the boundaries that I had so hoped to do by showing that we all have so much more in common than we've been led to believe, because we are all here because someone made some tremendous sacrifice so that there could be a sea of purple robes in an auditorium on this day and all over the country of people who are the descendants of people who did such a thing. And so my goal for you would be, in moments of darkness, to think back to the moment in all of our backgrounds that had to happen just for us to be here. This is the moment of departure, the moment when a young person, perhaps around your age, had to look into the eye of the person who had raised them, their mother, their father, their grandmother, their grandfather, a great aunt, or whomever it might have been, because they were about to make a crossing, a journey into the unknown. They might have been about to cross the Atlantic, the Rio Grande, or the Pacific, and they had to look into the eye of the person who had raised them. That person was not going to be able to make the journey with them. They didn't know when they would see that person again. And the person who had raised this individual from a baby had to look into the eye of that person that they had raised and wonder if they would ever see them again alive, because they were not going to be able to make the crossing with them. They were going to have to stay in the old country and hope and pray for the best for their loved one. And that child for whom it was imperative to leave, they just had to go in order to be their fuller selves, did not know when they would ever see this person again. The next time they might hear about that person, that mother, that father, that great aunt, that grandmother, might be a telegram that said, "Your father has passed away," or "Your mother is very ill. You must come back to her immediately if you were to see her alive." These were the days before Skype. There was no email. There were no cell phones. There was not even reliable long-distance phone service. The people in all of our backgrounds who are responsible for us being here today, who did not live to see us, who could not even perhaps imagine what their descendants would ultimately do, had to make that tremendous break from all that they knew so that we could exist, so that we could thrive and survive. And I hope that you will think about that as you make your decisions and move forward from this day. I want to leave you with this. These are the words of Richard Wright, who is in some ways the great bard of the 20th century Great Migration that I've written about. He's one of the great novelists of the 20th century, and he was someone who actually participated in this migration and spent most of his career writing about it. He wrote these words in retrospect about the moment of departure, the moment when he had to leave the only place he'd ever known with no guarantees of success, but hoping that things might work out. And this is a message for anyone on the cusp of a journey, wherever it might be. He wrote, "I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking a part of the South to transplant in alien soil, to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps to bloom." And my message to you would be to think back always to all that's gone before you, to those who made this great leap of faith before you, and are the reason why we are even here today. If these people in all of our backgrounds could do all that they did with absolutely nothing but in some ways faith, grit, and courage, and some deeply held belief deep within their hearts that somehow what they were about to do was going to yield fruit, which is you, then that means that there is nothing, absolutely nothing, that you cannot do. Congratulations to all of you, and thank you so very much for this honor to me.